So good evening, everyone. It's wonderful to see so many of you here tonight. I'm Anna Remington, Director of the Centre for Research in Autism and Education, and thank you for joining us for the 2025 CRAE Annual Lecture. CRAE is a team of autistic and non-autistic staff and students based within the Institute of Education, UCL's Faculty of Education and Society, and part of the Department of Psychology and Human Development. We aim to conduct high-quality, cutting-edge research, but also to ensure that the results of that research reach those who stand to benefit from them. The CRAE Annual Lecture is one aspect of that, allowing people both within and beyond academia to hear from some of the key researchers, practitioners, and advocates in the field. And through everything that we do, we take a participatory approach, which means we work with autistic people in all stages of our research and initiatives, from the initial design right through to the sharing of outcomes. We hope that this means that the work we do is meaningful for the autistic community. At this point, I'd like to say a big thank you to all our funders, supporters, and team members who contribute to our work and make it all possible. In particular, a special thank you to Pears Foundation for their generous ongoing support that underpins everything that we do. During the pandemic, we moved our annual lecture online, and we've never moved it back because we were delighted to see how many people were able to engage with the event from all over the world. It also means that today we're able to welcome an international speaker for tonight's lecture. I'm delighted to introduce Professor Vikram Jaswal. Vikram is a professor of psychology at the University of Virginia. He's a developmental psychologist whose research focuses on communication and social interaction in autism, particularly non-speaking autism. His work is inspired and informed by the lived experiences of autistic children and adults and their families. And on a personal note, Vikram's work on challenging assumptions about autistic social motivation has been the basis of many of my lectures for a number of years. Tonight, Vikram will be talking about misconceptions about non-speaking autistic people and how he's been collaborating with non-speaking autistic people and using the tools of cognitive science to correct some of these misconceptions. Thank you so much for speaking this evening. We're really looking forward to it. You are all very welcome to put any questions you have for Vikram in the Q&A box. He'll speak for around probably 45 to 50 minutes, and then CRAE's wonderful Brian Irvin will ask him as many possible questions at the end, and you can also post those questions anonymously if you prefer. And now I'm delighted to hand over to Vikram, who will be talking today about supporting non-speaking autistic people's flourishing.
Thank you so much, Anna, and thank you to all of you. I'm just going to share my desktop here with you. Excellent. So thank you so much for that warm introduction, Anna. It's a real pleasure to be here and to be able to share some of our work with you. Before I start, I just want to say that I'm such an admirer of the people and the research being done at CRAE. As Anna's introduction suggested, it's really, I think, a model of how excellent and respectful autism science and scholarship can be done, and authentically including autistic people from the beginning of the research through the whole process by doggedly pursuing questions that are of interest and of importance to the community, and by the commitment to training neurodivergent scientists. So this is certainly a model that we look up to in our group. So I'm just really honored to have the chance to talk with you today. So I am a developmental psychologist, and for the first part of my career, maybe the first 15 years, I focused on questions in typical development. And about 10 years ago or so, I started to transition my research program to address questions in autism. And so today I'll tell you a little bit about that transition and how it came about. And I'll also tell you, of course, about the meat of the talk, which will be these 3 lines of work that are designed to support flourishing in non-speaking autistic folks. So one of the major inspirations for my transition to autism science and to the research I do was a community engagement seminar that I taught at the University of Virginia for a few years. You can see pictures of the 3 cohorts here. The seminar was called The Science and Lived Experience of Autism. And each year, a group of about 20 undergraduates and 10 college-age autistic young adults got together and participated. And during the course of the seminar, we got to know each other a bit. We shared a lot of laughs and a lot of meals. And the autistic students really provided the UVA undergraduate and myself with this remarkable opportunity to learn about autism alongside people who are living it. And this is Elizabeth Vossler here in the corner, who was my collaborator in that endeavor. So my experience in teaching the science and lived experience of autism really led me to question a lot of the conventional scientific wisdom about autism, and it shaped my research program in fundamental ways. So, for example, one topic that was repeatedly raised by the autistic students in the seminar concerned their desire for social connection. And as you probably know, one of the oldest, most widely held beliefs about autistic people is that they lack an interest in social interaction. And as Anna mentioned, one line of my work has focused on this erroneous belief. But that's not what I'm going to tell you about today. I've told you that our partners were these college-age autistic folks, but I didn't yet mention is that they are also non-speaking. So about 30% of autistic people can't communicate effectively using speech. Well, this includes folks who don't say anything, people who might repeat back words and phrases, maybe some folks who speak a little bit. Non-speaking people can and do communicate in lots of other ways besides speech, so body language, proximity, and so on, but they can't communicate effectively using speech. So they can't readily share information, thoughts, beliefs, memories, and so on in a conventional language-based way. And in addition to not being able to effectively use speech, non-speaking autistic people are autistic. They might act in socially non-normative ways. They move in unusual ways. And, if speaking autistic people are denied access to educational, social, employment, and community opportunities, imagine how difficult things are for this 30% of autistic people who are non-speaking. They are perhaps the most marginalized of this already marginalized group of folks. Well, just a terminological note before I go on. I use non-speaking to refer to this group rather than nonverbal or minimally verbal, because I think non-speaking more accurately characterizes what it is that we know about these individuals, which is that they can't speak. And it's also the preference of the particular community that I spend time with. Okay, so we don't know why about 30% of autistic people can't communicate effectively using speech. And it's not because they lack the motivation to communicate. I don't think it's because they lack the capacity for symbolic representation. I think the most likely explanation has to do with the significant motor challenges that most non-speaking autistic people face, and which involve difficulties in planning and executing intentional movements. Speech is, of course, the finest of fine motor abilities. The vocal apparatus has to be coordinated perfectly in order to produce intelligible speech. Well, naturally, attempts have been made to provide non-speaking autistic people with access to communication, but these traditional approaches are limited in a number of ways. One commonly used approach is called PECS, or Picture Exchange Communication System. It involves these laminated cards, which you can see here with icons or pictures that can be used for requesting things. So if someone wants a cookie, they could exchange the picture of the cookie for an actual cookie. And the idea with PECS is that over several stages of training, the individual would learn to sequence icons in order to make comments and ask questions. Unfortunately, very few individuals actually progress beyond that requesting phase. And even when they do, this communication system is obviously limited because the vocabulary that's made available to a user is chosen by somebody else. Of course, PECS-like systems have also been created for tablets and iPads, but they have many of the same limitations. Verbally based interventions are also common. Here, one underlying assumption is that lack of speech is caused by reduced levels of motivation. You already know I don't put much stock in that belief. Verbally based interventions might use motivating objects to encourage people to speak. So if somebody wants a cookie, they have to make a vocal approximation to the word cookie. Turns out this is also not effective for most non-speaking autistic people. In fact, a recent review of the only 2 randomized controlled trials focused on communication interventions for non-speaking children concluded neither of the interventions resulted in maintained improvements in spoken or nonverbal communication in most children. So most non-speaking autistic kids and adults are never provided access to an effective form of language-based communication, despite undergoing years or decades of interventions like those I've just described. Well, maybe this goes without saying, but I'll just make it explicit. being able to express yourself is so essential to well-being that it is considered by the United Nations to be a fundamental human right, right up there with the right not to be enslaved, the right not to be subject to torture. So providing access to communication is a social justice issue. It's a human rights issue. Okay, so I said that this group of non-speaking autistic students participated in the university seminar I was teaching, and that we discussed autism among other things. How did these discussions take place? The folks in my seminar communicate in writing. They've learned over the course of many years and guided by parents and professionals to point to letters on a letterboard like the one you see here. The letterboard is held vertically by a trained assistant, and this allows them to spell out their thoughts and ideas. Now, I have to make 3 important points at this juncture. First, this is a method that developed in practice, not in research. So some of what we end up doing is reverse engineering why this method is effective for some people. The second important point is that this is not something that these individuals learned overnight. And the third point is that all the folks I know who communicate with assistants currently are working on the skills to be able to type independently without assistance. And that's their goal. And at the end of the presentation, I'll show you an example. But at the moment, their most effective means of communication involves the assistance of another person who's holding the letterboard vertically as they spell their thoughts and ideas. So I'm going to show you a video of a 22-year-old who began learning to use a letterboard about 6 years before the video was taken. So she's wearing a camera that allows us to see things from her perspective. She has a limited ability to use speech. If you met her and you introduced yourself, she might respond with a stock greeting and maybe her name, but she certainly would not be able to respond using speech to the question that you'll see her respond to here, which is, have you ever experienced uncertainty? The other thing you should know about this particular participant is that even though she can't use speech effectively to convey her thoughts, she's reached a point in her practice of this communication method where she calls out the letters verbally before touching them. And sometimes she'll say a word after she's pointed to all the letters in the word. Oh, one important thing is that because of our internet connections, sometimes there's a lag between the audio and the video, depending on the speed of your connection. And so the clips I show you today are all available for download, and I'll provide you with the QR code later in the talk. So remember, this is a participant who was asked in the course of a conversation whether she ever experienced uncertainty, and she spells her response.
Have you ever experienced uncertainty?
E-V-E-R-Y, very, O-N-E, everyone. D-O-E S-I-M-N-O-D-I.
Keep going. D-I.
F-F-E-R-E-N-T. Different.
Everyone does. I'm no different. So after that big buildup I gave you about most non-speaking autistic people never being provided with access to communication, and this being a social justice and human rights issue, I hope you're thinking, wow, this is awesome. This non-speaking person has clearly gained access to a method of communication that is clearly effective for her. And in fact, it is effective. This particular individual graduated from college in 2022 with a degree in biology. You probably also have a lot of questions like, what's the training process like? Who is the method likely to be effective for? How could this particular person be best supported in her goal of transitioning to independent typing on a keyboard? And you probably also have questions about the role the assistant plays in terms of the attentional, regulatory, and emotional support they provide. And these are the kinds of questions that we're interested in too. But we've also had to address an elephant in the room. As you may know, there are critics who insist that non-speaking individuals who communicate with assistants couldn't possibly be conveying their own thoughts. They think that the assistant is somehow cueing the user to particular letters or moving the board underneath their finger in some kind of Ouija board-like manner. I'm going to lay my cards out on the table here. I think really what the critic's position reflects is disbelief that someone who can't communicate effectively using speech, who is autistic, who moves in unusual ways, who maybe acts in socially non-normative ways, disbelief that they could have sophisticated thoughts like everyone experiences uncertainty. I'm no different. I think it suggests disbelief that such a person could be literate, could have learned out how to spell such thoughts. And I think it also suggests that the critics haven't had the opportunity to spend much time with non-speaking autistic people who communicate in these ways. It'd be one thing if these critics were just gadflies, but unfortunately, they have succeeded in preventing non-speaking autistic people from having access to this and related methods of communication in schools and other settings. The non-speaking autistic people I know, including those who participated in the seminars I've taught over the years, well, they're absolutely aware of the critics. And having their communicative agency questioned takes an incredible toll on them. Imagine being denied the only effective means of communication you have, not being supported in school to use it, and so having no way to participate or to gain an education because a small but strangely influential group of people who's never met you, never interacted with you, has decided that you couldn't possibly be communicating your own thoughts using this method. So, inspired by these lived experiences of non-speaking autistic folks and in collaboration with them and other members of the community, we've embarked on several projects over the past few years where we apply the tools of cognitive science, which is what I am trained in, to questions about communication in non-speaking autistic people. So today I'm going to tell you about 3 lines of work. I'll tell you about some work investigating communicative agency among those who are learning to communicate by spelling. Another line of work that addresses questions about literacy in this population, and a third line that asks how we might leverage advances in technology to provide some folks with personalized communication interfaces. All right, so our first study was an attempt to investigate how plausible the critics' explanation of Letterboard users' performance is. This was work done with Allison Wayne, who was an undergraduate at the time, and Hudson Galino, who's a quantitative psychologist in our department. So remember that the critics argue that users are somehow being directed to each letter they point to. So to investigate this, we recruited a group of non-speaking young adults who communicate with assistants. We fitted them with these eye-tracking glasses like you see here. This would allow us to record what they looked at and pointed to, and then we asked them to spell responses to a bunch of questions, including the one you saw earlier, have you ever experienced uncertainty? We measured how quickly and accurately they looked at and pointed to letters as they responded to the questions. The data we recorded were derived in the real world, in a setting familiar to the users, doing an activity that was really familiar to them. This same kind of approach, collecting data in the world naturally, has been used in cognitive science to investigate questions about other complex skills like typing, for example, piano playing, golfing, and so on. So to set the stage for why speed and accuracy are relevant to whether Letterboard users are being cued to the assistant to point to particular letters, I have to tell you a little bit about something called Hicks' law. So Hicks' law is a well-documented constraint on information processing. It says that the amount of time it takes to respond to an external cue increases as the number of cue response alternatives increases. Well, let me unpack that a little bit. Let's say there are 2 buttons in front of you, A and B, and you undergo some training to learn that when a green light is illuminated, that's the cue, you should press the A, that's the response. And if a pink light is illuminated, you should push the B. Later, after you've learned these associations, when you see the pink light illuminated, if you were a participant in Hicks' 1952 study, it would take you about 250 milliseconds to correctly press the B. Now, suppose that in that initial training phase, you're presented with 10 buttons instead of 2, each of which is associated with a different light. So you learn that the red light, let's see, is associated with the F, And the pink light in this case is associated with the E and so on. Now, when you're presented with a pink light, if you were a participant in Hicks' original study, it would take about 500 milliseconds to press the correct button, the E in this particular case, about twice as long as it took when there were just 2 cue response options. And that is Hicks' law. Response time increases as a function of the number of cue response alternatives. And you can think about why. Well, when you're presented with a cue, you have to detect the cue. You have to, in order to respond correctly, you have to retrieve which response goes with a particular cue, and that's going to take you longer when there are 10 cue response alternatives than when there are 2. And you have to execute the response correctly, and that's also going to take more time when there are 10 cue response alternatives than when there are 2. So how is all this relevant to letterboard users? Well, let's take that case of everybody experiences uncertainty. I'm no different. If the speller were being cued to the letter E, the assistant would have to have delivered a cue that reliably disambiguated which of 26 letters the user was supposed to point to, which the user would then have to detect, decode, and act upon. And this sequence of events would have to be repeated for each letter in the sequence of the response. Each of these steps, the assistant's delivery of a cue, the user's detecting, decoding, and acting upon the cue, this would take time and would be subject to error, particularly given that there are 26 possible letters to select from, so 26 cue response possibilities. So if letterboard users were slow or if they made a lot of errors, this would be consistent with a queuing account, but fast and accurate spelling would not be consistent. So our first question was, how quickly and accurately do spellers spell? So from the video, we could identify when a participant's finger made contact with a letter, left that letter, and when it made contact with the next letter. Over the course of their 20-minute experimental or observational session, participants spelled answers to 24 questions, and in doing so, they pointed to, on average, over 300 letters. Over 90% of the letters they pointed to were correct in the context of what they were spelling, so they rarely made a mistake. And they were pointing to about 1 letter per second. So participants were very accurate, and they're moving along at a pretty fast clip. We also asked whether users looked at letters before pointing to them. If they do, we can say that they're not just passively holding out their finger and waiting for the assistant to move a board under their finger, but they're actively selecting the letters they're going to point to themselves. Well, we know from decades of research in cognitive science that sighted people tend to look at things before they interact with them. Why is that? Well, because you're going to be much more accurate at adjusting your movements, at calibrating your movements toward a target if you make use of visual feedback. So let me show you an example of this from our study. The participant you're going to see this time is a man who was 26 at the time the video was taken. The video is like the one that I showed you before, but I've overlaid the eye tracking information on it. And the eye tracking information is represented by this red dot that you can see here. So on this particular frame, you can see that the user is both pointing to and looking at the W. So just to be clear, nobody sees this red dot during the session. It's only visible in the video that's produced after the session is ended. So what I want you to notice when I show you this video is how clearly that red dot, representing where the individual is looking, precedes his point to each letter. So in the course of a conversation about waiting, this individual was asked, can you think of something you've had to wait on?
W, A, I, T, I, N, G, waiting, F, L, R for M, Y, my, D, R, E, A, M, G, I, R, L. Waiting for my dream girl.
Waiting for my dream girl. So perfectly appropriate for a 26-year-old man. So we can code the videos frame by frame, so we can identify whether participants looked at letters before pointing to them, and if so, by how much time that look preceded their point. So the question is, do spellers look at letters before pointing to them? As you saw in the video, the answer is yes. In fact, the average percentage of letters that participants looked at before pointing to them was 71%. And if participants were just holding their finger out as the assistant moved the board beneath it, you wouldn't expect that they'd look at letters before their finger made contact with the letters. Furthermore, these anticipatory fixations, these looks that preceded their points, occurred on average about half a second before a user's finger made contact with the letter. So participants were spelling quickly and accurately, and they fixated most letters about half a second before pointing to them. Finally, we also identified two patterns in the pointing and gaze data, which when you observe these patterns in studies with non-autistic typists, studies done for entirely different reasons, these patterns have been attributed to the cognitive processes underlying fluent spelling. Specifically, participants were faster to look at and point to letters within words than letters at the boundary between words. And in non-autistic typists, the analogous finding is interpreted as reflecting the planning for the production of the next word. And participants were also faster to look at and point to more common letter pairs or bigrams than less common letter pairs. So, for example, they would be faster to get to the letter E if the word was hello than the letter E if the word was jello, because HE is a much more common bigram in English than is JE. And in non-autistic typists, the analogous finding is interpreted as reflecting the internalization of spelling rules and regularities. Okay, so together, the accuracy, timing, and visual fixation data we collected are consistent with what you'd expect if participants were communicating their own thoughts. They are not consistent with the cueing explanation that critics have put forward. I have to be clear here that I'm not suggesting that everybody will be able to learn to use a letterboard to communicate. Different people are going to benefit from different kinds of support, but our data clearly show that the blanket dismissal of communication that involves the assistance of another person is not warranted. Okay, I want to turn to the second line of work that I'll describe today, which is a study investigating literacy in non-speaking autistic people. This was done in collaboration with two graduate students in my group. Here's Andrew Lampy, he has graduated, and Caden Stockwell, who's an advanced PhD student in my group. In this study, we asked whether some non-speaking autistic people have learned to spell. And you might ask, doesn't the fact that there are folks who communicate by spelling on a letterboard already show that some of them have learned to spell? Yes, of course, but it's important to have converging evidence from multiple methods, particularly given the charged atmosphere around methods of communication that involve the assistance of another person. So we developed a method to investigate one important aspect of literacy, namely whether non-speaking autistic people could convert the sounds of language, phonology, into their written form, orthography. Well, for someone who can speak, of course, you could just ask them to spell words and assess their abilities explicitly. But because our interest is in people who can't speak and for whom there might be other performance-related reasons that they can't demonstrate their abilities explicitly, we designed a task that could assess their ability indirectly. Using indirect tasks like the one I'm going to tell you about is very common in cognitive science. These indirect tasks allow developmental psychologists to ask questions about how infants understand the world, cognitive psychologists to build models of information processing, and social psychologists to demonstrate implicit biases. So the logic is that you might present participants with two tasks that differ in just one dimension, and then measure how long it takes them to complete each task. If they're faster on one task than the other, then it suggests that participants were processing information in the two tasks differently. So our method was inspired by the whack-a-mole game that was popular in the 1980s and 90s. Remember that game where you were just supposed to whack each mole with a mallet as it popped out of its hole? To my knowledge, The moles popped out in random locations. But imagine how much faster you'd be if you knew in advance the sequence in which the moles were going to pop out. And this is what we attempted to exploit in the study I'll tell you about. So participants in our study saw letters of the alphabet displayed on an iPad, like you see here. And the task was simply to tap whatever letter they saw pulsing as quickly as they could. Now, on some trials, participants were told in advance what the sequence of letters would be. The experimenter would say something like, on the next trial, the letters will flash in a sequence that spells, I should water the backyard today. Because they'd heard the sequence ahead of time, if participants could spell, they could anticipate what the next pulsing letter would be. We compared how quickly they responded to pulsing letters in that letter condition with a condition where the same participants responded to sequences of pulsing nonsense symbols. Now here the targets pulsed in the same locations and in the same sequence as in the letterboard condition, but because the targets were nonsense symbols, regardless of whether participants could spell, they wouldn't be able to predict where the next pulsing symbol would be. Okay, so just to make it clear, our question was whether participants would be faster to tap pulsing letters in this letterboard condition, where they could predict the sequence if they knew how to spell, compared to this closely matched symbol condition, where they couldn't predict the sequence regardless of whether they knew how to spell. They could only respond to the pulsing target. So we conducted this study with 31 non-speaking autistic adolescents and adults. Our participants had experience learning to use a letterboard, but I want to emphasize that this study was conducted entirely on an iPad, secured on a stand in front of participants. No one held the iPad or touched the participants. And the task was simply to respond as quickly as possible to each pulsing target. So were participants faster in the letterboard condition compared to the symbol board condition? Indeed, they were. So here you can see the letterboard condition. Here you can see the symbol board condition. And on the y-axis, it just shows you reaction time, the average time between taps. The average time between taps was shorter in the letterboard condition than in the symbol board condition. And remember, the only difference is that in the case of the letterboard condition, participants who knew how to spell could anticipate or predict the next letter in the sequence in a way that wasn't possible in the symbol board condition, where they could only respond to the pulsing target. For those of you who are experimentally and methodologically inclined, you might be wondering whether, well, maybe letters are somehow easier to detect when they're pulsing compared to nonsense symbols, and maybe that's what explains the effect. No, in fact, one of our control conditions involved letters pulsing in a meaningless rather than meaningful sequence. And just like in the symbol board condition, users were slower. We can also look at these data at the level of the individual participant. How much faster was a given participant to tap targets in the letterboard condition than the symbol board condition? And that's what this figure shows. So in this figure, each dot represents an individual participant, and dots below 0 mean that a participant was faster in the letterboard condition than the symbol board condition. They showed this signature pattern of literacy. Dots above 0 mean the opposite. And the error bars just represent 95% confidence intervals. So as this figure shows, most participants, it's 16 out of 31, showed the signature pattern. What do we know about participants who didn't show the pattern? Well, we can't say that they're not literate or they don't know the rules of spelling. They may just not have been able to demonstrate it on our particular task, which of course required speeded responses to over 550 pulsing targets. Our sample consisted of people who had very little speech, as well as folks who had some speech. And so one feature of the data that I think is really interesting is that 7 out of the 12 participants without phrase speech, so that's in the purple triangles, these are people who have the least speech. Some of them don't say anything. 7 out of the 12 participants without phrase speech showed the pattern, and 9 of the 19 participants with limited phrase speech showed the pattern. So even among those who had the least speech, about half of our participants showed the signature pattern of literacy. With this rich data set, we were able to investigate a couple of other interesting patterns. So you remember that each trial in this sort of whack-a-mole game involves a stream of continuous text without any breaks. The task is just to tap whatever target you see pulsing as fast as you can. But a literate person who has heard the sentence in advance that's about to be presented might impose some structure on the sequence, parsing the stream of continuous text into words. And we would be able to see this if they paused at word boundaries, even though there's no requirement for them to do so. This would demonstrate that they recognize where one word ends and the next word begins, which of course is inherent to literacy. And this is exactly what we found. Participants were slower to tap the first letter of a new word, you can see that in the purple function, than to tap letters within words. And a second pattern we investigated in these data involved asking whether participants' reaction times were affected by orthographic regularities in printed English. So remember in the eye tracking study I described in the first part of the talk, I explained that in English, certain letter pairs or bigrams occur more frequently than other letter pairs. And in research having nothing to do with autism, it's been shown that typists are faster to type common letter pairs compared to less common ones. So we investigated whether participants were faster to respond to the second letter in a letter pair, the more common that letter pair was. And this is exactly what we found. On the x-axis here, you can see bigram frequency, how common a given bigram is in the printed English language. And on the y-axis is the amount of time to tap the second letter in the bigram. Now you can see participants were faster to tap the second letter of a bigram, the more frequent it is in English. Again, suggesting that they had internalized orthographic regularities, the spelling rules. Again, for those of you who are methodologically inclined, I mentioned before that we included a control condition in this study that involved meaningless sequences of letters. It was actually the same sequence as in the meaningful case, but just in a backward direction. So in this control condition, you could not predict what the next letter was going to be. We asked whether bigram frequency exerted any effect when the sequences of letters were meaningless. And in this condition, we found no effect. That's the green function that you can see. That's kind of a flat line. We found no effect of bigram frequency on latency. So even though we know from the letterboard condition that participants had internalized orthographic regularities, these internalized spelling regularities did not exert an influence on reaction time when participants were responding to meaningless sequences. And this is exactly the same finding, actually, that a former colleague here at the University of Virginia found in studies with non-autistic typists maybe 40 years ago. In those studies, Tim Salthouse demonstrated that expert typists who were copying passages of text when it was meaningful text, bigram frequency exerted an influence on reaction time, but when it was meaningless, not so much. Okay, so these data suggest that most participants in our study, including those who don't speak at all, have acquired an important aspect of literacy, the ability to convert the sounds of language into their written form. Of course, we don't know from this study how participants acquired this skill. It could be that learning to communicate by pointing to letters, which all participants in our study had experience learning to do, maybe that was part of the process. That's a subject for future work. Okay, I want to turn now to the third and final part of my talk. So far, my focus has been on documenting skills that folks who communicate with assistants currently have. In this last part of my talk, I'll tell you about some work we're doing to try to understand how we can leverage technology to support communication in non-speaking autistic people. This is a project done in collaboration with Divakar Krishnamurthy in electrical engineering at the University of Calgary and a team of his students, along with several people in my lab. So let me just begin by describing what augmented reality is. Augmented reality is a way to make it seem like virtual objects are part of a user's actual space. So if you were wearing a device like you see Chelsea and Kate wearing here, if you were wearing that device in your kitchen, you could place a hologram of a vase on your actual counter, and you could see your actual refrigerator and your actual stove. So it differs from virtual reality in that it's not immersive. There is a certain wow factor to augmented reality. So these are just a couple of videos from Microsoft, which produced the device that we use called the HoloLens. And you can see it's like really cool to interact with the Death Star. It can also be used for educational content. So somebody here is interacting with the elements in the periodic table. Why would we be interested in using augmented reality with non-speaking autistic people? Well, my first response is, why shouldn't non-speaking autistic people have access to the same kinds of cool technology as other people? But in the case of AR, there are some aspects of it that might make it a particularly attractive learning tool for this population. So material can be hyper-customized and personalized for a specific user. For example, the size of any hologram, including those with text, can be adjusted to suit particular individuals' needs. Holograms can be made to follow individuals around, and not a lot of non-speaking autistic people seem to be in constant motion, so that could be a helpful feature. Game-like modules can be developed to practice some of the motor skills that are required, for example, in typing. And then there's the potential to actually create interfaces that could be used for communication in this environment. But our first step in this project was to demonstrate that non-speaking autistic people could tolerate wearing this device. It weighs over a pound, and that they could learn to interact with the holograms. So in collaboration with non-speaking autistic people, their families, and clinicians, we developed a protocol to introduce users to the HoloLens and a game that involved pushing a holographic button in order to see an animation of a fox. There were 3 rounds in this game, and each round became increasingly difficult. So the size of the buttons decreased, and subjects were required to push buttons before a countdown timer ran out. So we tested a group of 17 non-speaking autistic young adults on this sort of proof of concept study. Our first question was whether non-speaking autistic people could tolerate the device. And here the answer was a resounding yes. 15 out of the 17 wore the device long enough to start the game, and most actually completed the game without ever taking the device off. The next question was whether non-speaking autistic people could learn to push holographic buttons, and here also the answer is yes. All 15 who started the game completed at least 2 rounds of the game, and most completed all 3 rounds. Furthermore, this is interesting, subjects got faster on subsequent rounds of the game, meaning that they easily learned what was required to activate the holographic buttons in 1 round and transferred it to the next, even though the task was becoming more difficult as the buttons got smaller and a countdown timer went more quickly. So we've since built on these findings to work on a bunch of additional projects related to communication. I'll just give you one example. This is a study led by Laurence Alaboud. He's a postdoc in Dr. Krishnamurthy's lab. He asked whether spellers who are skilled on the physical letterboard with assistance could transition to using a virtual letterboard independently. And he found that indeed, after a short, maybe on the order of 10 minutes training procedure, 16 out of the 21 participants in that study could spell short words on a virtual letterboard independently. And some actually went on to offer some feedback about the experience, including this person. You can see, I think it says it was about to spell interesting. So I chose a good example. We think this opens up all kinds of exciting possibilities on the practical side. We can use machine learning to figure out the optimal placement of a communication interface. In addition to enabling predictive text based on word frequency, you could enable predictive text based on the location where somebody is communicating, could automate some of the prompting that the human assistant would otherwise provide, and so on. So stepping back, I think it also has the potential to make possible more private communication, which is something that a lot of members of the community have asked us about, communication that doesn't require an intermediary, between friends or between an individual and their healthcare provider. A long-term goal of this kind of work is the creation of a personalized interface that would make communication for non-speaking autistic people as effortless as speaking is for most people. Okay, so I've told you a little bit about 3 projects about communication that we've been working on in collaboration with non-speaking autistic people. As we learn more about autism, particularly from autistic people, we're also learning how little we understand about it, and that many of our assumptions about autistic people are wrong. These assumptions aren't just incorrect, but they have prevented the kinds of flourishing that everybody would like to see. So I want to end with a short video that I think really brings this point into relief. This is Grant Blasco. He's a non-speaking autistic person I know. He's a college student at the University of Washington. Grant now communicates by typing on a tablet. You can see that in the inset in the upper right-hand corner. The app he uses involves predictive text. As you'll see, Grant communicates independently now, but to get to this point, he spent many years communicating with lots of different kinds of support from another person. So I'm going to show you this example in part because I think it provides a demonstration of someone who can now type without that level of assistance. The other reason I want to show you this clip is because it's part of a 30-minute video that you can find on YouTube where Grant responds to a 2022 meeting of the IACC, which is in the United States, a committee that coordinates autism efforts in the federal government. So the meeting that Grant is responding to focused on non-speaking autism, and it involved presentations from some scientists. And well, as you'll see, Grant had some reactions to the studies they presented and to the assumptions they made about the participants. Because of limited time, I'm just going to show you Grant typing the last 2 words of the first couple of sentences that he wrote and then pressing period, which triggers the system to read out everything he'd written up to that point.
Yes. Present. Dot. Hi everyone, I want to get a few things off of my chest. I'm instantly frustrated each time I listen to research presentations that detail how many assumptions are made about the participants. And I am also surprised that during the review process, nobody calls out the obvious biases that don't consider alternative ideas for why an apparent deficit is present.
I think Grant's comment is a powerful note to end on, so I'm going to leave things there. I want to thank the non-speaking autistic people I've had the privilege of getting to know for helping to move autism science in a more useful, progressive, and data-driven direction. And also, of course, I want to thank the participants in the studies that I've told you about today for their willingness to participate. And finally, thanks also to the funders of the work and the research assistants and graduate students in my lab and collaborators at the University of Calgary for their generous contributions. And thanks to all of you for your attention. The published papers, by the way, that I talked about today are available at my lab's website, which is just www.jaswallab.org. If you go to jaswallab.com, that'll take you to my sister's lab website. She's a biophysicist. So I'm going to stop there, and I'm happy to answer any questions that may have been coming in through the chat, Brian, and of course to continue conversation offline via email as well. Thanks again.
The chat has been so lovely. There are so many thanks in the chat. Also in the chat, and this is the thing I love about CRAE lectures, the number of folk who help each other out. I've been keeping an eye out. You lot are properly lovely. It's really lovely to have you on board. Can I also say a big welcome to Letterboard users who are in the chat. Isn't it so lovely that you can be part of these things? And that's what these webinars strive for, that hopefully we can open up some of the gates and let people in. Before we go on to questions, please do put your questions in the Q&A box. I will also be zipping through the chat to see if there's anything I can hoover up from there as well. A couple of sort of notes on what you've just been telling us before we go on. First of all, I love the history of it, the way that you took through your story via this community engagement cohort. And here at CRAE, we're a neurodivergent bunch here at CRAE. And this learning from insiders' perspectives is one of the things that brings us continual joy. And hopefully we can feed back to the communities, and hopefully we can make the places where we live a little better. There was, I think, a powerful testament to the idea of the non-speaking marginalisation. Well, we do this because folk are being marginalised, they're being pushed out of our communities, out of our societies, and that's wrong. And it helps us get up in the morning to help fight that kind of stuff. And taking that trip through, yeah, I used to be a teacher, I used to have to do the PECS kind of stuff. Taking us through that to find something a little bit better in letterboards, and finding it in a method that came from practice. The phrase I think you used was reverse engineering the good stuff. And that's how we should be doing stuff. Well, you know, we shouldn't be dreaming our stuff in our ivory towers. We should be going out to find out what works and then making damn sure that everybody else gets their paws on it. When you were talking, it was that notion of disbelief that the, what did you call them? The critics that sometimes have. And again in this field, it's those that don't believe that people have their own voice. And they're the ones that sometimes, you know, maybe that's why we're doing science, so we can put the boot in to the critics. I did like that. Disbelief, I wrote, robs people of agency. Your cognitive science has given that agency back. And I think that's a powerful thing. You then went on, you told us 3 lines of argument. That about agency, the eye tracking. The thing you said as an aside is that eye tracking is also used for golf. And the fact that we use the technologies of golf to give maybe the critics a little bit of a poke. I like that. I like that a lot. You then went on to talk about literacy, the whack-a-mole spelling. You know, I come from all the sort of social scientist stuff rather than the hard cognitive science. You allowed me to understand that. And whack-a-mole spelling is something I can definitely get my head behind. And lastly, the augmented reality. And I noticed in the chat, yeah, you talked about agency, you talked about literacy, and then the chat started filling up with, oh, what about the technological? And then bang, it was there. And it's the sign of one of those great lectures is that we were sitting there and going, oh, we see where you're going with this. And then you brought in the augmentative text. It's a beautiful way of, I've just written cool tech for all, but actually opening that up. And particularly, I think the thing that hit me was that need for privacy in conversations. And the augmented tech gives people that dignity to do so. Our assumptions in autism science for many years have been wrong. And I think hopefully we're coming back onto the right path once again. So thank you ever so much. That was just my quick summary. I can now, and one of the reasons I do give a summary is to give everyone a chance to put questions in. So are you ready, Jaswal? Vikram, have you had a little glass of water? Because there you go.
Your summary, by the way, Brian, better than AI. Thank you so much. You did a wonderful.
I was accused in the last paper I submitted of sounding too much like AI in my natural voice. Yes, I know you've got a lovely jar of what looks like moonshine there. Please do wet your whistle before we go ahead. I'm going to start off with a question in the Q&A from Adrienne. I hope I'm pronouncing that right. I'd love some research pointers from Vikram for an opinion piece that they're writing, which draws historic parallels between deaf people being considered too intellectually disabled to be showing their own communicative agency when sign language was first developed. The argument then went on, it was involved in the whole sort of, shall we just say, racist IQ tests that were going on. And the discriminatory resistance we're hearing now is, again, picking up those parallels that have been going on. What analogies do you have to talk about that discrimination that is at play within letterboards?
Oh, thank you.
I hope that question made sense.
Yeah, thank you for that question, Adrienne. And I mean, I think that you're absolutely right. The historical parallels are eerie. I think that it stems in large part from, obviously, I'm not the first person to make this point. It's a long history. It stems from this belief in the supremacy of speech, even if it's implicit. It's the expectation that somebody needs to speak in order to have very much going on up there. And we know that that's not true. There are plenty of people who can't speak for a variety of reasons, who can demonstrate, who have gained access to communication methods, who can demonstrate what they know. And so, like, I think, like, exploring that opinion, that opinion piece will be wonderful. Please send it to me. That opinion piece will be wonderful. And I think exploring these historical parallels is so important. I think in the deaf community, it's sometimes referred to as autism. I think of it as speechism, the belief that speech is necessary. Speech makes somebody more human. And, there's research that has nothing to do specifically with autism, but about dehumanization. And when people are asked to list some of the qualities of what it means to be human, the ability to speak is one of the first things that they list. So, I mean, I think it's just really entrenched, and we have to push back on that. And so, Adrian, again, I appreciate your efforts and look forward to reading the opinion piece.
I always find it deeply odd that it is the capacity to speak that's put up there rather than the capacity to listen.
Yeah.
Moving on to other questions. Question is from Mark. How difficult is it to build associations between letters and words and what they mean for a person who has had to use gestures and pointing to their life at some point? I think that goes to a deeper question that I have as well, is where does this emerge from?
Oh, well, I mean, boy.
Big questions.
Give us 50 years and we will start to work it out. But I think, a lot of the folks that I spend time with are immersed in a print-rich environment. And I think there's some good research to demonstrate that some autistic people are really good systematizers, for example. They're very good pattern recognizers. And so there's some reason to believe that being exposed to being exposed to a print-rich environment and having the closed captions on when watching YouTube and Netflix, like these things can actually be useful. And I think sometimes there's this tendency, my experience has been, to think that autistic people are not affected by some of the same things that we have reason to believe non-autistic people are affected by. And so, like in the work I mentioned at the beginning with regard to social motivation, that autistic people wouldn't care whether somebody, says that they got a bad haircut or whatnot. But also that autistic people maybe learn so differently from non-autistic people that there's no overlap between the kinds of things that foster the development of literacy in non-autistic people. And I think that that's just not true. I mean, I think we share a lot of the same machinery, and there are going to be differences, but we can benefit from the kinds of research that has already been done with non-autistic kids and adults when it comes to literacy. I think the question was related to literacy, and maybe Brian,
just some of the stuff that we're doing here, that the fact that you're talking about having rich informational worlds that can actually then allow these kind of things to emerge, I think is deeply important, because too often in the name of sensory sensitivities, too much information is taken away rather than too much ick and bright shiny fluorescent lights and all the bad stuff, and actually leaving that ability to communicate behind is what we might be trying to aim for, rather than
I think I mean, I think of a quote, I think it's Tracy Thresher, who's a non-speaking autistic man, who wrote, autism is at least partly a deficit of experience or opportunity, right? So lots of opportunities that are routinely offered to non-autistic kids and adults are rarely offered to autistic children and adults. And, somebody can't be expected to know how to play the piano if you have never provided them access to a piano. And why would it be any different for, lots of educational topics, lots of communication opportunities, literacy, numeracy, etc.
A glory of information that should be accessible to us all in the ways that we need it. Moving on to next questions, we'll go to Jessica's question. Did any of the participants have any augmented communication in place before college? And was that not effective? I mean, is there something about going to college in particular that links in here?
So I should be clear that the community partners in that initial science and lived experience of autism effort that I was engaged in, none of those folks at the time were in college. Some of them has since gone on to take community college courses. One person has graduated from college. So at the time, they were not enrolled in college. And prior to participating in the seminar that that I ran, they certainly had experience learning to spell in the way that we've discussed, and they certainly, over the course of the first 15 or 18 years of their life, had been given all kinds of other, both traditional speech therapy, but also other kinds of AAC approaches that just were not as effective for them at that point in their life as spelling was. I should say that another thing that I think is interesting about access to communication is there's sometimes like a real tendency to think something that doesn't work now is never going to work. And I don't think that's the case. Like, development is not that linear. Like different
big spiral.
Yes, and different things are going to come online at different times, and depending on the other things that somebody's working out and working on. Like so there could come a time where, and the other important point that I'll make is that I think people should have access to as many different ways to communicate as possible. So yes, spelling is going to allow somebody to be able to communicate anything they want, but admittedly, it's going to be much faster if there's a button that you can push that says yes, or a button that you can push that says, the weather is nice today, if that's important in the daily life of a person. So, I think people should have access to and should be encouraged to and allowed to, and we should do everything we can to foster as many different ways of communicating for them as possible.
As a proud Londoner, I'm so glad you went to "What's the weather like?" buttons. It's all they talk around here. Got a question from Kaylee. First of all, Kaylee says it was a beautiful presentation. Do you have any recommendations on how schools can support parents and families in using communications apart from PECs, particularly the technology-based versions? What's good and easy, and shall I also say cheap for schools?
Yeah. Well, this is a hard question, Kaylee. Thank you for that question and for making it difficult. Yes, I think that, for example, all of the folks that I know who communicate with assistants at the moment, I don't think any of them were given opportunities within a school system to learn, a public school system to learn the method that now works best for them. And so these are people who had access, have resources, and their families were able to make it possible for them. I think one of the challenges absolutely is this systemic issues around, going back to the speechism question, around what should be the priority. Should the priority be continuing to try to teach somebody to speak even though they can't speak? I mean, I have a friend who asked the question, gosh, if somebody's using a wheelchair, would you insist every day? No, you need to get up and get out of that chair. So I think there are some systemic issues that also have to be addressed. And I think some of this is changing. I think a lot of AAC experts have now been able to forcefully make the case that, no, we're not going to wait until somebody is 5 or 10 years old before we begin providing them with methods, with alternatives to speech. So I think I suggested that PECs doesn't seem to be effective in the long term for many people. But again, right, it doesn't mean that it's not effective for some people some of the time to allow somebody to be able to say some body part hurts, or to be able to express a preference for something that they might not otherwise have been able to express. So, I mean, I don't have the magic bullet, obviously. I don't have much in the way of concrete advice at this point to offer, other than to say, I really appreciate the efforts of educators who are, I know, trying as hard as they can to provide as many different ways as possible for their students to access communication. It's not the fault of the student, right? It's our failure of creativity and of imagination to think about ways that we might better be able to support somebody to access communication.
And that was, I haven't been a teacher in schools for more than 10 years now. And back then, one of my big sadnesses in PECs was the limited, not the limited vocabulary, the limited scope. Mm-hmm. The fact that I was working with children and they didn't have well, slightly rude words that the rest of the contemporaries were using. That there's a limitation in there, and actually by giving agency and giving freedom, we can open up minds to all kinds of things, even the things we might not like as educators.
Yeah.
I think that's quite important.
Well, I think that's really important. I mean, I have a friend whose daughter is a non-speaking autistic person who communicates by spelling. And at some point, her daughter explained that they were having a conversation about housing. They had just seen a documentary that showed a speaking autistic person who had moved into some kind of independent apartment. And so she asked her daughter about what she'd like to do, and had assumed that the response was going to be, oh, I want to live with mom and dad. But no, the daughter explained, no, of course I want to live on my own, or, with support, with in a supportive environment, with a roommate, whatever. But like, I'm not going to live with my family forever. I think the other important piece of that, just to make this explicit, just like with regard to how different kinds of ways of communicating may not be possible at some points and may be possible at later, the same is true of housing, right? I mean, my goodness, how many people go away to college and live in a dorm and then move back in with their parents and then go out again, and then, right? So like people's housing situation changes too. But to this point, like it is important that people have a way to express something that we may never have thought was something that they wanted.
I've just got half an eye on the chat, and there's a little bit about chats. I'm talking about good humor with it all. That actually, you can't make a good joke on a PEX board. And I think that there's definite wisdom in there.
Yeah, it's like, the fellow when he was asked, can you think of something you have to wait on? And he spelled out,
yes,
my dream girl.
I'm now waiting for the follow-up. Did he? That's the research I want to know. Did he get there?
Well, I hope so.
So question from going down a different route now from Pashar. I'm very aware we've probably got maybe 5 minutes or so before we might run out of steam here. But from someone who has a history in using AR and VR quite practically, they're curious, Parashar, of knowing if you have any commercial solutions that are out there that are either tailored for kids or that can be easily hacked together. That was my question that I added to there. And how do you utilize that with kids in addition to being non-speakers that also have sensory sensitivities with the weight of the VR helmet?
This is a great question, right? I mean, we started out with this proof of concept study just to see even whether these young adults would be able to wear these devices. And the HoloLens device that we use actually is no longer made, and it was never meant for wide distribution. And so we have since switched to using things like the Oculus. So less expensive, also probably more commonly available. Families may have them for gaming anyway. And Professor Krishnamurthy's lab is very active in creating, currently developing apps to test, and hopefully sometime we'll be able to distribute these learning tools and maybe communication interfaces more widely. We have discussed, one day perhaps it would be possible to create bespoke glasses for this particular population, kids and adults, that would just be for communication, in the same way that sometimes it's encouraged that if you're going to have a device for a non-speaking autistic child or adult, you might want to make it so that it is communication specific. So you might have glasses that are communication specific, but we're not there yet.
This is my question. I'm going to use my privilege of not reading one out. Is there anything about sort of online communications? If you are typing in letter forms already, does somebody else have to be in the room that you're talking to? Or is it, a wonderful life lived on, I was going to say Reddit, but I'm not sure about Reddit. A wonderful life lived online through these friendships and communications that get built
well,
up.
I mean, already, certainly, augmented reality technology, great. I think it's something we should explore, and other kinds of technology. But already there's a very vibrant community of non-speaking autistic young adults and adults who are communicating with each other, supporting each other, having poetry slams. I mean, so it's already.
You say the best things. Poetry slam.
I wish I could take credit for it. But I do think that that, you know, the potential for peer-to-peer communication in an unmediated form, so where an assistant may not be needed, like obviously that's something that a lot of community members are interested in, and for good reason.
There's so many lovely things going on in the chat. I'm just going to read out something from Vicky in the chat, who talks, she says, we have a small school here in South Africa, which is based around S2C methodology. And their advice to parents before they're able to spell on the boards is that their child is to feed their child's brain with interesting and age-appropriate information. Respect your child and presume competence.
I love that. Yeah.
I love the chats around here. I mean, you lot look after each other so well. It's really, really lovely. I think I've got time for maybe one last question. I like this question. It's a bit of a tricksy one. It's a short question, but it's a bit tricksy. What do you think, Vikram, what do you think makes written language easier to acquire than oral language for some non-speakers? If you could put your finger on it, what do you think makes written language easier to acquire?
Well, I mean, it's less variable for one thing. So when you are making sense of speech or producing speech, you're having to engage in a lot of things beyond the, you know, beyond the production of the idea that you want to get out. And the same is true when you're spelling, obviously, but in, you know, like in terms of going back to one of the questions that we had earlier, like I think that there is something that a lot of autistic people have strengths in with regard to patterns and with regard to matching sound with, in this case, a sequence of letters and so on. So, I mean, I think that it doesn't require this fine motor skill that producing intelligible speech requires. You know, if I were going to start again, I think, and if I had the bandwidth, I might really try to focus on the motor challenges. Lots of other people are focusing on that issue. So like they don't need me, but I find it fascinating. And I would like to know the answer to this apraxia that a lot of non-speaking autistic people face is really serious. And it, you know, like everything, there are ups and downs, and some people who are speaking autistic people are unreliable speakers. So like some days they might be able to carry on a conversation without much difficulty. Other times it's just so exhausting for them that they can't. Like, I think historically maybe that has not been appreciated in the way that it should, like the testimony from people who experience that kind of phenomenon where they just are so exhausted by the effort that it requires to speak. People are just considered to be lazy or whatever, right? But no, like we have to take autistic people's testimony seriously. So that's not exactly the answer to the question. I mean, I wish I knew. I think it does have to do with the difference between the ability to coordinate the vocal apparatus, like the kind of effort that it takes and the kind of connections that have to be there, you know, may not be part of a person's repertoire yet. You know, there are people who, I think even in one of Connor's initial case studies in 1943 paper, he commented about an individual who, in learning to write, it seemed to improve her speech. So, you know, I think that just as a developmentalist, I think it's really important to keep in mind that, like.
So we have a Letterboard user called Matt J in the chat, and he's just written, when you're talking about that ebb and flow, that apraxia takes over.
Yeah.
There's that experience, and I know, having worked with some students who have days where language just evaporates, that having someone that understands you to sit with you and maybe just pull up a Discord, which, you know, I can chat on Discord. You can chat with your phone sat next to each other. It's one of those technological things that we're getting to.
Well, I mean, just to piggyback on that, I mean, Caden Stockwell, who I mentioned, a graduate student in my group, he's really interested in
an amazing scholar.
Yep, thank you. Yes, I wish I could take credit for that too. He's really interested in regulation in non-speaking autistic people and its particular relation to the ability to communicate. And, you know, one of the things that there's plenty of evidence in affective neuroscience and cognitive science and social psychology to demonstrate how important having a trusted resource, human resource, can be. Having a friend, a family member, somebody who you can offload some of your concerns to, how helpful that is physiologically, how helpful that is cognitively, and so on. So Caden is embarking on some fascinating work using wearable sensors and heart rate variability to investigate questions about physiological regulation in non-speaking autistic people when they're with somebody who they know compared to when they're with somebody that they don't know.
And having methods to do that communication when you're with someone that you know. I mean, I just want to stick it out for everywhere. If you've got teenage kids, whatever they are, and they start texting you when you're in the same room, at least they're texting you. Love it. Yeah. I believe at this moment I'm going to, Anna's back. There we go. I will leave Anna to wrap things up. Thank you so much. And on behalf of everyone in the chat, Vikram, you're an absolute star. Thank you.
Oh, well, thank you, Brian. Appreciate it.
I'm just going to echo that. I have the pleasure of thanking you once again, a huge thank you for being our 2025 CRAE annual lecture speaker this evening, and for giving such an engaging talk. You took such a systematic approach to the questions that you're asking and took us all along that journey in such an accessible way, and it was really wonderful to hear about the great work that you and your colleagues are doing. I know the audience felt the same. We've had so much engagement, as you know, in the chat and the Q&A box. So I just want to extend a last thank you to everyone who's come this evening for being so engaged, for posing so many wonderful questions and thought-provoking responses all the way throughout. And as some of you have asked, the recording will be available on the CRAE YouTube channel in the next few days if you'd like to watch it again. And I hope to see you all at another CRAE event very soon. Have a lovely rest of your evening.
Thank you so much, everyone. It was wonderful to be here. Thank you, Anna.